This is your friendly neighborhood author, Jonathan, and you are listening to Season 4 of the Floor Rejects podcast, The Wells House Phenomenon. Hey, it's me, your friendly neighborhood writer, author, podcaster, singer, writer, dancer, whoever, Jonathan here from the Floor Rejects podcast. I say that as if we're a large conglomerate. It's just me. It's just me. However, I would like to say hello to my first podcast supporter. Hi, Sarah. I don't think I know you, so that's exciting. I am very flattered, and I appreciate the support. Never really thought to say it because it didn't really seem like something anyone would be interested in, but you can basically subscribe to my podcast with a monthly fee. If you would like to do that, you can do that through Anchor. That's the podcasting system that I use. It's anchor.com. Actually, I think it's anchor.fm, which I don't really know what that stands for, but it's usually in the link of all the audio versions of the podcast, and sometimes you can find it in video versions as well. But last week on the Floor Rejects podcast, we covered Chapter 2, in which we met Lila and Thomas, the caretaker and groundskeeper, respectively, of the Wells Manor. Lila is Thomas's mother. Lila is very forward and friendly and helpful, and Thomas is pretty much devoid of having any personality. Warren went and bought himself a new car, a Jeep specifically, because he doesn't have taste. I don't know. I'm not a Jeep person myself. He really kind of leaned heavily into his wealthy side, we'll say, and spent a good chunk of his money all in one little gone, just like that. So that's where we were last week. Where we kind of left off is he had been escorted to his new bedroom that he was assigned, but really it's just the biggest bedroom in the house. And he fell asleep as soon as he got in there. He was tired. I think it was mid-afternoon, and he was going to take a nap before they had dinner together for the first time. So that's where we were. Now I will switch myself up to here, or here, or here, maybe here. Switch the lights. Alexa, it's podcast time. And we'll get started. Chapter 3. Close Quarters. Warren Wells didn't dream. He never had, really. He could count on one hand the dreams he could remember having, and that was just about all of them. So when he closed his eyes, he expected nothing but blackness. At first, that was all he saw, and his mind, almost completely shut down, was at peace. Then, suddenly, his room began to fade back in around him, the dark, ornately paneled ceiling rushing down towards him. He couldn't move, at least not at first, as the indigo and black bedding around him materialized, followed shortly by the walls in the same pattern and the heavy furniture. He struggles against the unseen force holding him still, fighting to wiggle his fingers, move his head, anything. He sees the door to the bathroom move, popping open with a small, almost human sigh. He struggles even harder, terror welling up in his chest, just as he feels his toes brush against his insoles. The door moves again, at the periphery of Warren's sight, and when he rolls his eyes towards it, he sees nothing but the shadow of something behind it move sharply. He tries to call out, looking to the main door, to signal to anyone around him, his brain not clearly processing that this was a dream, and yet as he opens his mouth, no sound comes out. He processes that he can feel himself shouting, but there's no noise. He can feel his fingers twitch now, and again he senses motion out of the corner of his eye. When he looks back, the bathroom door is now wide open, the room behind it pitch black. He's panicked, his internal dialogue nothing but one word: help. His nails scratch at the itchy fabric at his back, and finally he can feel his neck break free. His head snaps away from the darkened doorway, again silently shouting for help. He can feel his throat vibrating, and as he begins to regain more and more control, he balls the blankets in his fist, willing his body to move, to make sense of what was happening. Slowly, he can feel his legs begin to shake, twitching at the end of the bed, the sound of fabric on fabric instantly maddening. He begins to kick at the end of the bed, able to move his legs, and he can hear the sound of a bed jumping against the floor, and he prays that someone will open the door. His arms break free, and he grasps at his phone where he spots it, on the opposite edge of the bed, his chest still pinned in place as a figure appears, darkened in the bathroom doorway. The figure, somehow blacker than the blackness behind it, moves slowly, jerking forward towards him, its shoulders cocked and fingers curled unnaturally backwards. His body is electrified with fear. He's so close, his hand within an inch of the phone as it teeters on the edge. Just as a finger touches the screen and it lights up, he hears the ragged breathing of the figure. He looks back and sees it now at the foot of his bed, still enshrouded in unnatural darkness, and again he screams, silently, reached again more intently, but the phone slides out from under his fingertips, and he watches as it tips over the edge, hitting the floor with the sound of breaking glass. The figure leans down, its hands sinking into the fabric at his feet, and the blackness begins to spread, up the blanket, over his legs, and as it creeps towards his waist, he shuts his eyes, the ragged breathing growing louder and the stench of rotting meat wafting under his nose. He clenches, bracing as he feels the heat of breath on his face, and then sharp nails in his skin. He can feel his chest separate from the bed, and as he reaches up to fight back, he hears it. "Master Wells?" Lila's husky voice cracks into his nightmare. His eyes snap open, his chest rising from the bed as he gasps. The room, now lit normally, bathroom doors shut, comes into focus in front of him. He looks to his left, and Lila is standing, one hand on the doorknob, looking at him in confusion. "Master Wells, dinner's ready, but I can come back later," she says, Warren still staring at her wide-eyed. He gulps, reaching up to feel his throat. No, Lila, that's fine. I'm sorry. I think I was having a nightmare," he says, catching his breath as he looks up and down the room, the nightmare immediately fading from his memory, just like every one that had passed before. Lila smiles at him reassuringly. "New house, new surroundings, new life. I'm sure it's just the stress of it, and I'm sure it won't happen again. Do you know your way to the dining room?" she asks. And Warren shakes his head, quickly climbing from the bed to follow her, not willing to spend a second alone in the room. Just as he shuts the door, he realizes he left his phone, the dream already fading. In the room, he can't find it, knowing he'd set it on the nightstand before he had laid down. He looks on every surface, under the pillows and on the table, but he can't seem to find it. As Lila peeks back in, she laughs, walking towards the side of the bed closest to the main door. "Here it is, Master Wells," she says, pulling the phone from an alcove in the opposite bedside table. He hadn't remembered putting it there, but he thanked her as they walked from the room again. Lila leads the way to the dining room, back the way they had followed Thomas from the entrance hall. He jogs a bit to catch up to her long legs carrying her much faster than he was as he tried to recover from the terror of a dream he had already forgotten. "I told Thomas this, but you can just call me Warren. Really, it feels weird to be called..." Ouch! Warren doesn't finish his thought as he pulls his hand from his pocket, red already smearing on his hands and jeans. A long, thin cut runs the length of his palm, and he clenches his hand, feeling the paper cut feeling in the soft skin opening and closing. "What the hell?" he murmurs as Lila leads him into the dining room. He reaches into his pocket carefully, pulling his phone back out and stopping dead in his tracks as he sees the spiderweb of cracks across his screen, as if he had dropped the phone. But he hadn't, not that he could remember. He can feel a tickle at the back of his mind, like he knew how it had broken, but he couldn't place it. He was pissed, ready to let it ruin his day as Lila placed a red-nailed hand on his forearm. "You must be more careful with broken glass. That's the problem with these new telephones. They're so fragile. Let me get you a rag," she says, rushing off into an adjacent room as Warren looks around, sitting at the head of a long, curved wooden table. Thomas sits at the opposite end, to one side, and Warren smiles at him politely. He nods. The room is covered in the same black and red wallpaper as the other rooms in the front of the house, and he wonders absent-mindedly if he could get permission to make some updates around the house. Just as he opens his mouth to ask Thomas about this, Lila comes up behind him, placing a rag in his still bleeding hand. "Hold that tight. After dinner we can get it properly dressed. Now, on to our celebratory first night's dinner, yeah?" she asks, and Warren and Thomas both nod. Warren feeling his stomach rumble as Lila pulls the first of several silver cloches, revealing a steamy, succulent-looking turkey. He can feel himself salivating, the smell of the rich, crisp meat drifting towards him as he watches her slice in, the meat falling over in delectable piles. Then, platter by platter, she scooped heaping piles of potatoes, corn, richly colored greens, and stuffing. As she sets the plates down in front of the two men, with 2 full glasses of wine, Warren laughs out loud. It was absurd to him that this was his new life all of a sudden. It felt impossible. Thomas and Lila look at him inquisitively as he stands, walking to the side of the table and sliding his meal so that he no longer sits at the head. He felt it was too big of a seat for him to fill. "Sorry, the food looks delicious. I can't believe this," he explains, and Lila sits down across from him, nodding as she flutters her napkin into her lap. "Yes, your grandfather was the same way. He spent the first 2 weeks refusing to let me cook because he had old food in his caravan. He never slept in the house. I hope you will allow us in the manor to take care of you, Warren. Your grandfather made his life harder than it needed to be here because he didn't want to believe this was all his. Now, it's all yours," she says. As she finishes, Warren notices that neither of them had even picked up a fork. In fact, they were sitting, hands poised next to their silverware. Thomas's eyes focused in on Warren's hands. "Well, I don't think I need to be that hard to convince. Why aren't you all eating?" he asks, and Thomas looks up, his expression empty and tired. "We don't eat until you do. Manor customs," he says, and again Warren scoffs. "Well, as the new, owner, you all don't have to wait on me," Warren says, and the pair smile politely, Thomas digging in aggressively, Lila delicately picking at a salad. The food was delicious, Warren eating seconds and then thirds. The wine went down smoother than anything he had ever tasted. He had a few glasses, enough so that his entire body felt warm, and that when he looked around, the edges of his vision blurred slightly. He knew he was still in control, but much farther down in the bottle and he wouldn't be. As dinner concluded and Lila cleared the plates, Warren wobbled, trying to stand and help her clear the dishes. As he attempted to gather his own plates, stacking them sloppily, he hears Lila laugh. "Let me, Warren. It's my pleasure." The way she says his first name now is almost sensual. Warren tries to stay rational, assuming he's just drunker than he thought. He settles back into the plush chair, looking over to Thomas, who stares blankly at the wall. "So, Thomas, are you always so quiet?" Warren asks, careful not to slur. Thomas looks over at him. He's almost looking confused to be spoken to. He looks up, thinking for a moment. "Yes, I guess so. Only people to talk to are my mother and whoever lives in the house, and generally, she demands most of the attention," he says, and Warren nods through his haze. He can relate always falling into the background of any situation around his family, too. He leans forward, willing Thomas to keep talking, but Lila walks back into the room, smiling broadly at him. She sets down a small tin on the table, kneeling in front of him. He can feel a cold sweat spring from his pores, but as she grasps the hand that he had cut earlier, he cools down, but only marginally. She smiles up at him, gently pulling the now dried rag from his palm, Warren hissing involuntarily as it pulls at his broken flesh. "Don't worry about this. Thomas is always hurting himself somehow, so I'm adept at this. Wouldn't want you to have to rush off to the hospital, especially not this late," Lila says, smearing a stinging white cream on the cut, and when Warren hisses, she smiles wider, looking up at him from under her fiery red hair. Warren, confused and drunker the longer he sat, looked at Thomas, hoping for some reassurance. He was looking at the walls, his cheek flexing as he clenched his jaw. Warren was supremely uncomfortable. He'd always been much more reserved than those around him when it came to physical proximity and touch. He didn't like to be touched, and when people even stood too close to him unintentionally, he would do anything he could to move. A therapist once told him it was because he never felt platonic, caring physical touch or intimacy from those who he needed it from most, and that made sense. But now, as a full-fledged, sexually awakened queer person, in the South no less, this type of interaction made his body feel so tightly wound that he was ready to crawl out of his skin, even as the alcohol continued to permeate his bloodstream. Lila was about done, he hoped, as she wrapped a bit of gauze a couple of times around his hand, and she stood, braced herself on either side of his chair. An innocent enough gesture, but as his vision swam, he was more and more sure that this was some ulterior process she was continuously hinting at. She didn't linger, instead swishing back to the doorway, bracing herself on one hip against it casually. "Should we have coffee in the parlor? Or here at the table?" she asked, and Warren is worried if he stuck around much longer that he would be completely helpless, and he didn't want these people to see him like that, and he didn't want to be at their mercy because his paranoia was spiking. Actually, Lila, I am so tired between the flight and driving. I think I would just like to turn in for the night," he tells her, and Thomas makes a small sound that Warren doesn't even register, and Lila looks at them both with disappointment. "Okay, Warren, but if you need anything, you know where to find me. Leave your keys on the table before you retire," she instructs him, and as she turns back, presumably to the kitchen, Warren again feels the rush of a cold sweat, unsure why she would tell him he had to leave his keys. He again looks to Thomas, who returns his gaze not coldly, but with little emotion. "For your rental vehicle. You asked that we return it," he explains, as if Warren was an idiot. Warren laughs nervously, remembering that he had asked for that, and stands, wobbling towards the archway as he had come through. At first, he is confident that he can make it on his own, but just through the threshold he stumbles, catching the edge of an old floorboard on his sneaker, and begins to fall forward. Just before his feet completely give out, though, Thomas's hands are again under his arms, steadying him. He would normally tell someone to get lost if they had presumptuously grabbed him up, but for the second time, he was reluctantly grateful as Thomas rights him, a hand on each bicep. "Sorry, I guess too much wine," Warren says, and for the first time, Thomas cracks a small smile. "Happens every time," he says, pulling one of Warren's arms over his shoulder. Warren is, even through his drunkenness, embarrassed, knowing he should be able to get himself to his own bed, but as they turn from the entrance hall to the hallway leading to his room, he stops. Can you take me to my grandpa's trailer?" he asks, and Thomas pauses for a moment. Warren can't read his expression, his eyes unwilling to focus from the side, before Thomas turns them around, leading him quietly out the front door, into the frosty night air. When they bust through the front door, Warren groans in relief at the stale, familiar air. Thomas sets him down on the bed, looking confusedly at the outdated yellow panel for the lights, heat, and cooling, and Warren waves him off. Don't worry about it. The heat didn't work when he lived with us. I doubt he got it fixed. I'll be fine," he says, and Thomas nods, looking to Warren for a moment as if to say something more, but simply says, "Good night," and backs out the door, closing it with the telltale clanking sound of a trailer door shutting. Warren exhales fully for the first time since he'd stepped back into the house, watching his breath cloud in front of his face. He fights sleep just long enough to drunkenly pull the dusty sheets over him, and then he's asleep. He didn't have another nightmare. Instead, he slept the way only people on the verge of a blackout do. That is to say, Warren Wells slept like a rock that first night on the grounds of the manor. He didn't wake up when the dust in the blankets puffed up around his nose. He didn't wake up as the temperature dropped below freezing, or when the door to the trailer popped open with a gust of wind. And when he woke the next morning, rubbing his hand on the frosty window above his bed, he felt like hell. In the aggressive morning light, he could feel his heart beating and his head pounding, and then, just as he managed to lean up off the bed with a groan, he felt the first heave roiling in his stomach. He sprang to his feet, not even bothering to look in the bathroom of the trailer, knowing it would be in disrepair, and instead ran out the already open door, vomiting as soon as he made it to the back side of the trailer, spraying out over the perfectly lined lawn. He groaned, knowing he would have to confess to Thomas or face the possibility of permanently alienating him. He shuffled into the trailer again, cursing at the latch on the door, knowing it had been faulty, but forgetting to tie the string that his grandfather always had attached to the handle. He didn't particularly want to go into the house, knowing full well that the duo, as he began referring to them in his head, were inside. When he looked out, though, he sees that the rental car is gone, as is the truck. He realizes that meant they must both be gone, and so he half walks, half hobbles up the front path, losing his dinner once more behind a topiary, and falls against the front door, all the blood rushing through his head and threatening to burst through a vein. He curses, realizing that the key to the house was on the keyring they now had, and he tries the handle, knowing it would be locked. When the door swings in, he looks up, thanking a God he didn't believe existed for the blessing of a hot shower before sneaking through the door, being as silent as possible even though he knew that the house had to be empty. He manages to find his way back to his room, the dark, windowless space somehow less threatening when he was so desperate, and he shuts the door quietly behind him, again thanking his non-existent deity when it doesn't make any sound but a click of a latch. When he opens the other door, at first he sees blackness, but as his fingers eventually find a button, he finds himself in a short hallway, lined on either side by shelving and rods, all empty save for one old pair of boots that he realizes are his grandfather's as he draws closer. Emotions, fueled by his hangover, rush over him, and tears begin to fall silently down his cheeks as he furrows his brow, willing his eyes to stop. He knows they are his grandfather's, not because he recognized them, but because they were so worn and tattered, with the steel toe exposed on one of them and laces tied together after snapping, that he knew they were his grandpa's. The man had been, as long as Warren had been alive, a person who only cared for function, never aesthetics, and instead spent his time caring for others. So when Warren saw these worn and tired boots, he could picture his grandfather's leathered, kind face in his mind, seeing the man teaching him how to tie his own shoes, or telling him how to string a bow, or handing him candy on the sly at dinner. His heart began to feel again as if it was going to break, much like it had when he sat alone in his apartment for a moment after receiving the news. Physical pain floods his chest and fills his lungs, and when he pushed himself up from where he had fallen to his knees in front of the shoes, he prayed that no one came home and heard him sobbing as he pulled open the bathroom door at the other end of the hallway and fumbled for the light, pulling his clothes angrily from his body and tossing them about the dark room, suddenly and completely alone in his mind. He hadn't spoken to his grandfather for a while, but just as his fingers find the switch and he finds himself staring at his body in a massive mirrored wall, the pain leaves his mind as fear takes over. For a split second, just as the room is filled with the warm, dim light he's accustomed to from the house, he sees a figure standing behind him in a corner, shrouded in darkness. With nothing but his pants around his ankles and his shirt in hand, he stumbles, squeaking in fear and tripping, smacking hard on the floor. As his vision returns to focus and he stares in fear at the corner, he sees that there's nothing in the corner. He stands carefully, rubbing his behind, shuffling towards it, where he finds nothing but a small cabinet and a pile of books under a mass of half-melted candles. He laughs in relief, turning back to the room to take it in. This room was completely tiled in off-white squares, and the ornate hand-carved vanity was covered in distressed, aging white paint. The room felt out of place from the rest of the house he had seen, and the floor-to-ceiling mirror on one wall was the most modern thing he had seen thus far. An old toilet, its pipes exposed to and from the top of the room, was placed in the middle of a wall next to the door, and a large clawfoot stood in the middle of the room, a heavy-looking white curtain wrapped around it. He tries to keep his mind clear, his migraine rushing back to the forefront and his ass now pulsating from his fall. He turns the taps on the old pipes in front of the tub, unsure how to get the water balanced. Modern tubs were a universal knob, and this was out of his wheelhouse. The water is blisteringly hot almost instantly, and when he finally finds a middle ground, he pulls the rest of his clothes off completely, standing in front of the mirror as the room fills with steam. His auburn hair was a mess, matted to his head, and his curls frizzed out about his face. His pale blue eyes, always one of his favorite things about himself, were bloodshot, bagged, and tired-looking. His body, a slight chest, gangly arms and legs, and a stomach that was neither flat nor particularly round, made him turn away. He hated to look at himself. From the time he was old enough to understand what people found attractive, he told himself that that was not what he was, and every time he looked in the mirror, he was hard-pressed to find something good. He looked at the tub and stuck a foot in, groaning as the heat from it burned his chilled toes. Slowly he sunk down, the large tub sizable enough for him to sink his 6-foot frame into. He stuck his head under the water, scrubbing his scalp, feeling the thin strands flow through his fingers. The heat was enough to alleviate his headache and calm down the roiling in his stomach, and when he finally stands from the water, he's ready to face the world. He grabs a towel from the nearby rack and dries off, stepping back into his bedroom with his pants on. He shakes his hair out, and as he gathers his shirt over his arms, the bedroom door cracks, and he hurries to cover himself. "Warren, breakfast is ready when you are. We'll be waiting in the dining room," Lila says, only her mouth and nose poking through the door. "Just a second, Lila. I'll be out there as soon as I finish getting dressed," he says, hoping she'll realize how inappropriate it was to barge into the room. Instead, she lingers for a second too long, exactly as she was, not looking into the room, but still in it, before she shuts the door, and Warren grumbles to himself, pulling on his shoes before meandering through the house until he found himself back in the dining room. Breakfast was awkward, with Lila acting as if she hadn't noticed Warren's inebriation, and Thomas feigns nonchalance when Warren confesses to his expulsions in the garden. He offers to clean it up himself, but Thomas tells him not to worry about it, and as he took his last bite, he heard his phone trill. He pulled it from his pocket, careful not to cut himself, and sees that Rodney had called and left a message that the Jeep was on its way. The call dated 30 minutes previous. He smiles and excuses himself, walking out the door all the way down the driveway, taking nearly 20 minutes in the cool air as the better alternative to spending any more time with Lila and Thomas. When he gets down to the gate, he has to squeeze through the panels because the pressure pad wouldn't activate to let him out. As soon as he crosses the gate line, his phone begins ringing again, and he picks up. The driver was confused and said he'd been trying to reach Warren for the last 20 minutes, but Warren hadn't gotten any of the calls. He explains the way to the manor, and before long, he hears the growling of a massive truck. The Jeep rounds the last bend over a small hill before the truck does, lifted way up in the air. A grin splits his face as the truck comes to a halt in front of him, and a stout man hops down from the cab. He was in his late 40s, with the graying hair and a thick beard, and a burly, compact-looking body, no taller than Warren. He was exactly Warren's type. Warren observed carefully as the man squats low to let the tire strap loose, his pants riding down low, and makes sure to pay special attention when the man, Will, Warren learned his name was, scooted under the back of the Jeep, loosening another strap. Will's shirt rode up as he struggled with a latch, cursing under his breath. His deep, caramel-colored skin was stretched over a belly that was round and tight to him, the kind reserved for men who worked hard for their pay and made sure not to miss out on the richness of the food and drink their money bought. As Will handed him the keys, Warren forgot about his sexually piqued interest and instead giddily hopped into his driver's seat, pressing the start button and covering his mouth to stop himself from squealing in delight. Will chuckles, waving to a distracted Warren as he climbs back into his truck and drives away. Warren waves back, noting that Will made eye contact until his truck was well down the road. Warren considers rolling back up the driveway to the house, but instead puts the SUV into gear and heads towards town, determined to spend as much of the day away from Lila and Thomas as possible. He searches for malls in the area on his new GPS as he draws off of Thomas Street and toward Elkins, marveling at the car as it maintained its own lane, the steering wheel twitching autonomously as he drove down the highway, screaming the lyrics to his favorite songs on his new stereo, and reveling in the stares he got as he drove through town, suddenly forgetting how often he had made curt critiques of people who did the exact same thing when he drove his Acura and had no money. Quickly, Warren was becoming the exact thing he spent years pretending he wasn't, and he didn't care anymore, because he no longer had to answer to anyone. He felt nothing other than free, completely ignoring the fact that he was, in fact, permanently tethered to Thomas and Lila and the manor unless he wanted to give this all up. Warren Wells did not want to give this all up, And as he rolled into the parking lot of the closest mall with a selection of stores he could tolerate, he resolved himself to make it work, because he would be damned if he went back to struggling as a copy editor 60 hours a week just to survive. Okay, it's me, and I'm back, and I am regretting trying to film multiple videos in one day while simultaneously being in dry, cold weather, smoking cigarettes because I'm stressed, and not taking care of myself because my throat, my voice, she's having a hard time. And unfortunately, I'm looking at myself in the camera, and I see that I've got a distinct double chin when I'm gonna die. I'm gonna fall apart. I'm gonna die. Here I go, I'm dying. I have a distinct double chin when I look into this monitor while I'm reading, so I'm just going to read like this from now on, because that makes me want to die. Actually, what if I guess it doesn't really matter, I can just move myself here and look at you guys. So, this chapter, we don't get really much character development other than a continuation of Warren's kind of purposeful ignorance towards the way he's acting about money all of a sudden, because he spent the whole first chapter just hating everyone around him and acting as though his privileged life was something that he didn't want. And the minute it was offered to him, not only did he take the person who offered it to him up on it, but he's now really living a life quickly and efficiently, we'll say. So I do like that his character continues to kind of grow in the same pattern. I also like that Thomas at least smiles in this chapter. I will say, when I read this to you guys, if you're watching the video portion, there are some words that I change only because hearing them read, it doesn't make as much sense to you as if you're reading them. I don't know how to explain it. It's the same way that when someone says, like, if I were to say something like, have you closed the door? You hear that I say the twice, right? And that's a problem. But when you're reading something and it says the same word twice, or like, it's like a Facebook meme. Your brain kind of easily skips over repeated words. I'm going to die. I ate Taco Bell and I'm going to die. This was a mistake. Anyway, but your brain kind of like moves over those sorts of issues without really saying anything to you while you're reading it. But when you're just listening to someone read it, it's kind of hard to hear the same words over and over. So I'm not going to change the text version. It'll still scroll. If you're watching this, it'll still scroll and you might see some differences, but they're super marginal differences. Here's what I will say about Lila, Thomas, and Warren in this chapter is, in a lot of scary stories, when you start reading them, they kind of immediately are scary. And I love that. Don't get me wrong. I love immediately jumping into the scare. But not my favorite type of movie, but the movies that I find actually scary, that scare me to the point where sometimes I don't want to watch them, are movies that are more like, not psychological thrillers so much as a horror movie that's a very slow burn. So like a lot of your modern horror movies, horror stories are kind of jump scare, like, I love The Conjuring, do not get me wrong, but the scariest parts of The Conjuring, it's like one of my favorite movies. You can see Annabelle's behind me. One of the scariest parts of any movie in that universe it's the jump scares. Like in The Conjuring, when Lorraine is putting the wash up on the line, and the sheet gets loose and blows away and there's a body standing behind her. Like, stuff like that is so scary. But what's also scary are things like another moment in The Conjuring, which are the moments that I kind of want to base my story off of, not so much the scary moment. But like the moment where Lorraine, and if you haven't seen the movie, please watch it and then get back to me. In the movie, it's the same scene. She's standing there and she hears the creaking of rope. And only she can hear it. Ed is out there too, but only Lorraine can hear it. And you're hearing it in the background, and you see that she's trying to think about what it is, but she doesn't know where it's coming from. And it's like a slow burn for a second, and then all of a sudden it cuts to her again, and there's feet swinging behind her from the tree. That's kind of the idea I want to get to more than like a jump scare version. So if the first few chapters are just kind of setting it up, it's slow and it's not quite so fun. But when you're reading a book, like it took me 30, I'd say probably closer to 20 minutes to read each chapter without all of my mistakes that I have to go back out and edit. But say you spend 60 minutes into 60 or 80 minutes setting up a story that's going to be a 6, 7, 8 hour story that you're going to read and reread, hopefully. You spend maybe an hour of that setting it up so that when it starts to get scary and you start to look around for scary things and try and put stuff together, it's not, the story is flushed out enough and the characters are developed enough so that you don't have to do that later on down the line. Like, we'll already know who Warren, Thomas, and Lila really are within the first few chapters, so we don't have to keep learning stuff about Warren as we go on. Specifically Warren, because Lila and Thomas, again, we know that they're subject to change at any given time, and we also know that the part of this story, well, you don't know this, but I'll give you a little hint. Part of the story is the ways in which they change over time, and so we are going to focus more on them changing. So I do want to focus right now more on how Warren is quickly falling into this rich kid habit, this rich kid routine, and how easily he adapts to the idea of just not having friends and living in the middle of nowhere and doing nothing. So that's kind of what we're looking at this week. Not a whole lot of critique. I will say, I can tell when I've written a chapter kind of hastily versus when I've written a chapter pretty slowly, because the paragraph structure, which you'll see as they scroll back, because I'm not going to change it. This is literally like a rough draft of a story that I'm just kind of giving you this rough draft and saying, here's the story. Do with it what you will, imagine it and then run with it, because I do that with stories. I do that with things that I read or watch or whatever. I run with the story in my head after I'm done with it. Also, this is coming to you for absolutely $0. So, if the story's not perfect, what are you going to do? But still, I think it's a good... My aunt's calling me. Oh my God. Hello? Oh my God, what are you doing? Anyway, I had to talk to my aunt. What was I saying? I don't remember. It's not really that important. We'll end the video here tonight, but Alexa, set the office to warm white. I wanted to come back in normal lighting to say thank you to anyone who's supporting me, anyone who's coming here, listening to this story every week, or watching the Sims videos, because I know that they're not the funnest Sims videos, but I think they're interesting. I think it's a fun way to conceptualize a character that's otherwise all words. And also, again, thank my first actual monetary supporter, which is weird to me to say. I really appreciate it. I appreciate everyone who listens or gives me any sort of support at all. It means the world to me. It really does. But I'll be back next week because I need to mentally prepare for eating a metric ton of macaroni and cheese tomorrow, while simultaneously having political arguments with family members and really stopping to analyze this holiday in depth and how terrible it really is with the people around me. So with all that being said, I'll be back next Wednesday/Thursday, depending on when I upload, with a new chapter of the Wells House phenomenon. Now, let me cover you up before my FBI agent sees my butt. Bye.